Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another discussion brought to you by Turning Point Australia. We have a lot of interesting guests we bring on here, the Statesman series, but today we have another statesman we're going to be talking with, a constitutional law expert, the legendary Professor Augusto Zimmermann, who sent me a bio about the size of my hand. And I was like, Augusto, you're killing me here. Augusto, welcome to the show. I'm not going to do the formalities with your bio because I didn't know what to put in and what not to. It all seemed relevant, but maybe I'll put it in the description. Augusto, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. It's a total privilege to be finally able to talk to you.
Yeah, we keep our circles keep sort of touching when it comes to on the Facebook posts, or I'd share some great stuff from you, but we never actually had a face. To this date, we never actually had a face-to-face discussion, and it's awesome to finally make this happen.
Yeah.
Augusto, so you are in Western Australia, and you're one of the few constitutional law experts in the country. But also, just to make you even rarer of a fish, you are against what's happening in this country. I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer, but you're against the lockdowns, against the mandates, against a lot of the human rights violations, and you have the constitutional understanding to back it. A lot of people, they in our tribe, they talk the big talk about the constitution and all that, but you actually, come with all of that. That's why I didn't read out your whole bio because it's so long. What's your view of what's going on in Western Australia? Where do you see things going, and how does that tie in constitutionally?
Well, it's appalling what's happening here. I always tell my friends that I'm living in a comfortable concentration camp. It's still possible to have a coffee if you provide your identity. It's a totalitarian reality. And the premier seems to be feeling each day more confident about imposing these draconian measures upon the population. And I would say to you that this is because of a lack of proper respect for the rule of law and individual fundamental rights of the citizen that are being violated on a daily basis in Western Australia, total disregard for basic principles of constitutional government. And the premier is each day behaving more in a deranged manner. He has no proper regard and respect for the population because he treats everyone as his little children, if not as his slaves. So things are getting totally out of control over here.
What was your reaction to the Palmer case, the Clive Palmer case that we saw, where I think was that challenging freedom of movement across the country, which is a constitutional guarantee?
Yeah,
What was
it's
your view of
it's
that?
really ridiculous, this whole thing, because we would expect at least the federal government to be intervening on the side of the people and on the side of the Constitution. But Scott Morrison sent a very clear message to the government here that he would be supporting the border restrictions. So we had the two governments working together, conspiring against the people, and in the process undermining Section 92 of the Constitution that makes it very clear that when it comes to the free movement of people and products, we should have open borders. And the drafters were so concerned about this because this is one of the provisions that led ultimately to the federation, that the border should be absolutely free. That's the term used by the drafter of the document. So now we have the court saying that the borders should not need to be absolutely free because we are facing a supposed pandemic, and that could justify even the disrespect, gross violation of that particular provision.
Augusto, but we've got a federal government. As you said, they're meant to be fighting on our behalf. Why is it that Scott Morrison is doing this? I mean, today is Remembrance Day. We remember the blood that was spilled in order to give us our freedoms, because freedom is not free. I saw the Prime Minister say that we have to remember our freedoms and the sacrifice that was made, and we stood up to bullies. This is in the address that he put out this morning at 7 a.m. How is it that he can just say all of these things? Like, is he fooling people? What's your thoughts on all this? The federal government, I call him Silent Scott, I call him slow-mo for a reason. What's your feeling towards Scott Morrison? What should he be doing?
Well, it's very disheartening, this whole thing. But you also have to consider that he has been claiming to be unable to do more. He claims that these are the actions of the premiers. But this is not true. I'm a constitutional law professor for many years. Used to be the unit coordinator for the subject at Murdoch University for more than 10 years, and also associate dean for research. I might have done a decent job because the vice chancellor awarded me the chancellor's award for excellence in research, and I have written many articles on the subject. What I have to tell you is that it's very clear that the combination of certain provisions to be found, especially or grants of power to be found in Section 51, in combination with Section 109, according to a former Chief Justice of the High Court, Sir Harry Gibbs, could potentially render any state law inoperative, which means that these, at the extent of the conflict between federal law and state law, would render the state law invalid because of the clash between federal and state law. So there are many international instruments that could be used by the federal government in order to protect the fundamental rights and freedoms of the people. Of course, if Scott Morrison had a little bit more of appreciation for the legal traditions and rights, we would actually be able to appeal to basic principles of the rule of law that also dictate that a government needs to protect the fundamental rights of the citizen. One of the first decisions of the High Court was made by Chief Justice Samuel Griffith in 1909 in the famous Hewlett-Packard case, where he established that the judicial function must be based on three basic elements, and one of the elements meaning that the function of the judiciary is to uphold the law that ultimately serves for the protection of basic inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. And that's a decision coming from the first Chief Justice of this country. A law should never, ever be used as an instrument of oppression. And another thing is that one of the basic elements of the rule of law is legal certainty and proper separation of powers. We should never accept the executive to be dictating the rules according to decrees that violate the doctrine of separation of powers as a result.
But why did we get here? I mean, we've got a situation where a lot of our population are just being turned, switching on to politics, because for the longest time they've been disconnected. For the longest time, they didn't understand the concept that if you're not interested in politics, politics is interested in you. And, we all cite what happened in the early 20th century, probably too much. But do you see a revival happening with people connecting back with their democracy and how it works?
Well, I think there will be a great reset in many ways, but that can be going either way. There is no doubt that the system as it currently stands has proven to be undesirable because we don't have a proper separation of powers. The executive and the legislature have never been entirely separated. And another thing that you have to consider is that judges, even though they claim to be independent, they are ultimately appointed by politicians. And I'm clearly seeing by the decisions that I'm seeing, that I'm observing, that some of them even claim to not be entirely aware of the applications of the principle of legality. So, for instance, there was a particular judge who said that the principle of legality is not important. So that is a scary statement for a judge to make. So we have to make sure that judges are appointed by merit and that the executive somehow never, ever produces executive decrees, because the role of producing laws is the role of the legislature, the parliament. So we need to make sure that you can establish proper checks and balances that ultimately are created for the protection of these rights that I have mentioned, to life, liberty, and property.
Augusto, do you think that there's an appetite in the Liberal Party at all to, defend these values? I mean, Why is it the minor parties are the only ones sort of defending these values?
Well, very good question. If I had any hope for the Liberal Party, I would not have resigned. And I'm pretty sure that Robert Menzies would be very proud of me, because the party that now is supporting all this tyranny and oppression would not be recognized by the founder. I can tell you that Robert Menzies would resign from the Liberal Party in disgust, because he was a man who had a consideration for individual rights and freedoms. I decided to resign because I thought that this would be ultimately damaging to my image and reputation. I have always advocated for the rule of law. I have always supported the protection of individual rights, and the Liberal Party has miserably failed us. The state Liberal Party here in Western Australia was the cheerleader of the oppressive government that we have now in Western Australia. There was a total lack of opposition. And of course, that makes this premier thinks that he is almighty and all powerful, because actually he won by default. There was no real opposition in Western Australia when he managed to trash the Liberal Party, because it was a vote, a decision between Labor and Labor Light.
We've Augusto, you've been in the game for a while. I'm not saying you're old. I'm just saying you're very experienced. I just think that in the short time I've been involved in politics, I've seen a lot of people come and go saying that they're going to do change, especially in politics, whether it be in the Liberal Party or even in some of the minor parties. I mean, we saw Cory Bernardi's party come and go, and that was a big letdown. Where do you see things going with these minor parties? Do you think they're doomed to make the same mistakes as past minor parties, or what advice would you give them? Because a lot of them do listen to this show, and a lot of their members, we have a lot of a very broad base of members from the freedom, what I call the freedom parties, listening to this. What advice would you give them?
I think the advice that I have to give is the advice of unity. We are fighting against dictators, oppressive regimes now, and you have to make sure that everybody works together and there is no vanity involved. And we need to also make alliances, establish bridges. And I would like to see everybody here thinking that this is for an ultimate cause, the cause of freedom, the cause of the rule of law. I don't want to see this being about people and about egos. That is when we are going to have a movement completely trashed as a result. So we have to be able to make sacrifices now and to understand that this can be the greatest fight of our lives, the fight that we are going to prevail in order to give to our future generations a legacy that they will be eternally grateful for us, for what we are doing now. I want to tell you one thing. I would recommend the small parties to make alliances and to be able perhaps even to do mergings. But certainly they should never exchange preferential voting with the two major parties, namely Liberal and Labour. I would be very disappointed if the small parties started to sell their soul to the devil by making unnecessary concessions to the establishment. The establishment must go, and you have to act in a wise way, but also need to be altruistic enough to make the necessary sacrifices that are ultimately needed for the cause of freedom and the cause of the rule of law.
Augusto, that's such a great point, and this is one of the things that they've gotten wrong in the past. For those of you that don't understand preferential voting, just briefly, in Australia, we've got the most robust version of preferential voting in the world. What is preferential voting? It's basically where you have all of your candidates and you number them from the top to the bottom in order of what preference you want. So if your first preference doesn't get in, your second preference will. If they don't, then the next one will. And you keep going until someone reaches over 50%. And then that's the person that gets elected into parliament. Now, with the minor parties that we have, the great thing about our preference system is that it allows you to have all of these minor parties working separately, but if they preference each other, all the same vote they can all have a crack at getting the majority. Unfortunately, speaking from the state of New South Wales, we've seen in the 2019 election, they didn't preference each other in what we call the federal Senate election. And all of their votes, rather than preferencing each other, they ended up not preferencing each other. Some even may have cut some deals with the major parties, and then they didn't get one of the Senate seats. One of those Senate seats would have been really valuable right about, during this pandemic. It really would have put a stop into what Scott Morrison was doing. Augusto, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, Augusto. I've been very frustrated by this particular problem. And just yesterday, I announced the plan that I've come out with using the Turning Point Australia brand. I'll be putting how to vote cards out there. I do not like it when minor parties sell out their fellow minor parties that are freedom parties in order to get a seat over here or over here or over here. Because what happens is, as you know, I'm preaching to the converted. You know what happens. But just let me bring the audience on a ride. What happens, guys, is maybe you get a minor party. The major party approaches them, or vice versa, and the major party says, "Hey, I think if you preferences us over here in this marginal seat where we're trying to beat Labor, we'll preference you over here, and maybe you'll get a seat or two, some of your guys in." Now the problem with that is it undercuts all of the other minor parties that are trying to get up, because that's how these deals are made. It's really dirty, and I won't name the minor parties, but there are minor parties where I'm worried that may happen. And I think the best way to subvert that is by me putting a list out. I've got a great team of experts that are, they've done this in the past, and they've been very successful at leading swings. And this can be a list that you guys can trust, that you guys can take to the election, and you can actually, put your votes in and go from there. And the great thing about it is, if you don't like my list, that's fine. You can go find another one. But I built a lot of a fairly big following of people that trust my word on this stuff. They always ask me, "Joel, who do I vote for?" So out of necessity, we've got some local elections coming up on the 4th of December. And I'll be trialing this system in New South Wales. And then, of course, we'll be doing it for the federal election next year, because I think the best way to undercut minor parties from cutting deals is by me undercutting and saying, "No, you are not doing that. You're not going to make the same mistakes as past elections. I may be only 24, but I've seen what's happened in the past and what hasn't worked." And I think that this is going to take away their bargaining power, and we're going to really be able to make a dent in a lot of this stuff. So I'm not giving away all my secrets with with Plan B and how to vote. There's a lot more to it. But what do you think, Augusto? Am I naive? Could this work? Or
You're totally right. Look, these two major parties have proven to be entirely disappointing. And even if I can refer to Western Australia, the Labour Party tends to win in working class areas by default, because the Liberal Party doesn't even show up for the game. But now we know that the Liberal Party embraces some agendas that sometimes are even worse than the agendas proposed by the alternative party. It seems, according to a friend of mine, that they are the same bird having different wings, the right wing and the left wing. The opposition leader here, even before the election, conceded defeat after supporting a green agenda that was so radical that even the Greens would expel him from the party, because not even the Greens would be so daring and ultimately so stupid to propose the sort of environmental agenda that he was offering to the electorate here in Western Australia. So I think they have reached the expiry date, but we have to be very careful about electronic voting and the thing that is happening or has happened in America in the last election, because I wouldn't be surprised that, knowing now that we are going to teach them a lesson, they might very well introduce alternative electronic means by which it might be easier for the election to not be more transparent. I do not trust them because of the fact that they have been treated the citizens with utter contempt and undermining our rights in such a fundamental way. We have to keep an eye on them and make sure that at least the right to kick them out from Parliament is still preserved. I would like to see at least 99.9% of the political class having to look for another job in the future. We have to be very careful. We have to work together for the preservation, or better saying, restoration, I would say, because everything is now pretty destroyed, of those things that we used to take for granted until 2 years ago, before the pandemic, the so-called pandemic.
Yeah. Augusto, I don't have a massive following in WA, but I know that you guys have local elections happening over there, just like we do. We have ours on the 4th of December. I think you've got yours on multiple different dates. We've been finding that there's a lot of concerns about, not being able to vote in some of the locations here. And, we've seen the government put guidance out saying, no, you can vote, it'll probably be outdoors and, you'll be able to do it there. But they are putting some restrictions in where you can't hand out how to vote cards outside a polling booth, which doesn't affect my plan. Mine's all online. But are you seeing similar concerns in Victoria? And are people pushing to, go to mail-in voting, which is another kettle of fish that we'll come to later? What are you seeing with the local elections over there in WA?
Well, it's very disturbing, this whole thing. Even if you take into account that our dictator here has been praising Dan Andrews quite often, and he talks in a way that's utterly deranged and arrogant. He told even that people at this event that we held, the rally in Perth, should grow a brain. I think he is very disrespectful of the citizen. And I'm very surprised to see that the population is not then reacting more strongly against this sort of behavior, because he has no right as a democratic leader to treat the people in such a manner. I think what we have to do is to develop a better sense of self-respect and dignity, because no politician has the right to treat the people in such a manner. He has no right to use this sort of language at all. And as to what is happening, especially in Victoria, Dan Andrews is even being more daring than a certain dictator in the 1930s in Germany that was only renewing, I say only like that, renewing his emergency powers. Adolf Hitler didn't repeal the Weimar Constitution. But to be frank with you, during the whole Nazi period, Germany had one of the most democratic and more human rights-based constitution of those days. The point is that the constitution was not the basic principles of the constitution provisions were not respected, because, of course, the great Hitler, as the dictator used to be called in Germany, gave justifications for the renewal of the emergency powers, and the emergency power was constantly renewed, to the point that Hayek, in his book in 1960, he wrote an important book called The Constitution of Liberty, and he makes this point very clear, that every single dictatorship, every single arbitrary government, a dictatorial regime, starts with an emergency. That's the justification normally found by dictators to start the oppression. And then they go on justifying the renewal of the emergency powers on the basis that the crisis hasn't been solved. So we need to have the constant renewal of these provisions until, of course, the regime can be overthrown by external means. So we are actually allowing this situation to take place that can ultimately become irreversible. According to Hayek, emergency temporary measures, they have a natural tendency to eventually become permanent measures, and we are never going to have our rights returned, because the rights, when they are taken away from the citizen, they are very hardly returned. Don't forget another thing that's very important, that most politicians, in order to be desiring to be in the political class, they might have a natural inclination to like or appreciate accumulation of power. And that's why Lord Acton made the point very clearly in the 19th century that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's why then we need to have a proper system of checks and balances and a proper application of the doctrine of separation of powers.
Absolutely. We're seeing that a version of that play out in Victoria right now with these emergency powers being rolled out that will allow the Premier to discriminate based on race, sex, beliefs, religion, ethnicity. This isn't good. I can't remember. There was a similar bill passed in California. It was like an anti affirmative action bill. You know what affirmative action means. It's basically don't discriminate over there based on race. What's the deal with how do you reverse that? Obviously there's protests going on. On Saturday, a massive protest is happening in Melbourne. They've been protesting, every couple days. How do you push back against this, especially in Victoria? They're about to have the vote in the Legislative Council down there. They've got, the 20 votes that they need from the Labor Party, but they've got the 3 crossbench votes. They need just one MP to jump off, but it seems like they're all in Dan Andrews' pocket. What do you do if you're a Victorian, Professor?
Well, there was this Irish politician from the 19th century who was quite famous and also a lawyer, and he made this statement that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. When I moved to Melbourne a couple of years ago, I was surprised to see how much the Melburnians had a natural inclination to even worship government. And that's the price that now we are paying for trusting too much in an authorities. Perhaps this is a form of idolatry, and the result of the fact that we are no longer an entirely Christian nation. It seems that people have started to replace the God of Christianity with the God state, and the worship and deification of government is what is going to lead to our downfall if nothing is changed. This is something that is the main issue. As to affirmative action, and I connect this with the important issue of anti-discrimination laws, it seems that some Christians even are pushing for anti-discrimination law on religious grounds because they still think, some of them, that Scott Morrison is a Christian. Well, I can't see anything Christian about what he does, to be frank with you. I even feel offended by the fact that he claims to be a Christian. But we should go the other way around. So what we really need to have is the repeal of most of these laws that treat people with utter contempt and think that we are a bunch of racist people or bigots, because the elites, or I'm sorry to call them elites, by the way, I would perhaps use a better word. How about oligarchs? The oligarchies here, they want to divide people into ethnic lines. They want to divide people into gender lines, because that's how the ancient Romans used to do in order to conquer. We know very well that there is a saying for that. It's the divide and conquer strategy. And that's exactly what's happening in this country, where the ruling groups, they have the right to express their opinions, even in parliament, and being very offensive towards one another, but having all the freedom they want. But they do not extend the same freedoms to the people of this country, because they actually do not treat us with the proper respect. If you really had a democracy, we would know very well that politicians are appointed by the people to represent us. They should never, ever have more rights than us, or think that they are a privileged caste of individuals that happen to be above the law.
Yeah, I love that point as well about, division means death. A house divided against itself cannot fall. I'm really concerned, Augusto. I'm really concerned. Before, I don't want to sound ominous, but before the end, things will get so bad that people will have to work together. But until then, across the country, and this is a humanity problem. A lot of people, they'd rather build themselves up than actually help the country. And if we're going to get out of this, things are going to have to get much worse for people to put aside their petty, individual sort of aspirations, rather than help their fellow man and their fellow Australian. I'm really concerned about this, and this is something I'm always everywhere I go. When I started this show, not the Turning Point show, back when I started a year ago, I did a bunch of conversations called Thin Ice, and I also held the ARC show. And in every show, for the first maybe 3 or 4 episodes, I asked that question. I said, why is it politics attracts a certain type of person? There's the very slim minority, which are like idealists. I see myself that way. But there's also, it attracts a certain type of, it's like the Star Wars reference, scum. You'll never see a worse place of scum and villainy. I really feel like that's what we're seeing in Canberra, and a lot of the people that run for these pre-selections in the major parties, they've found it as a way to, climb the greasy ladder, and rather than help their own electorates once they get into Canberra, even if they get there with good intentions, it just eats away at them. How do you fight against the human nature on this? Is it just a God thing again? Is it a loss of Christianity thing?
Yes, I think it is in a certain sense. It's also the fact that if you decided to be really outspoken and to fight for the rights of the people, then you get persecuted by your own party. And you saw this happening even in Western Australia when good candidates were disendorsed, even just because they had the courage to raise some issues that are extremely important, but they contradict the narrative of the oligarchies. So that's the main problem with the parliament when it ceases to be the election of the best people in our society to represent us, and it becomes a group of people who are there for interests that are not necessarily connected with the aspirations of the people in general, of the population in general. The parliament can ultimately become so disattached from the people that they end up electing almost like the head of the criminal organization. That's the main problem. At least in the presidential model, they elect their king, who is actually separated entirely from the legislature. But the parliamentary system, when it becomes corrupt, it's very hard to solve the problem, because there is no proper separation between executive and legislature. And to make it even worse, because judges now, and we know, behave in a suspect manner, but that's the result of the fact that they are appointed by politicians. We do not really have a proper separation of powers. And now you see that the executive is ruling by decree, and that is a total violation of even the principles of parliamentary democracy themselves. They are not proper utilization of power according to the basic principles of parliamentary democracy.
Professor, I have a question about the National Cabinet. Someone pointed out to me a few weeks ago that the revelation that the National Cabinet isn't actually a cabinet. Guys, so for those that don't know, the National Cabinet is this thing that the Prime Minister, it's a mock cabinet that the Prime Minister set up with all of the other premiers that would make these decisions on, the coronavirus measures. It's not something that, we've actually had before. It was shown in court, and I think it was the High Court, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, that this is not a real cabinet. Now, someone very astutely pointed out to me that because it's not a real cabinet, that means that it doesn't have like a cabinet's privilege. It doesn't have that sort of privilege of to have the seal. So we should be able to see what they're talking about. Has anyone made inquiries to actually?
Well, this is very important, because you know that according to our constitutional conventions, if the people becomes entirely silent on this subject and they continue to meet on a regular basis in order to make such decisions, that can create a sort of convention that is considered unwritten, but they can actually become normal practice, because our parliamentary system is very unwritten in many ways. You see that the constitution of this country apparently gives an enormous power to the governor general. You know that the governor general really doesn't exercise his or her powers in a proper manner, because they are indirectly appointed by the government of the day. So it's very hard to see the governor, or the governor general for that matter, to veto legislation, for instance. We have never had such a situation happening in this country. So, and these things are nowhere to be found in the Constitution. The role of the Prime Minister, for instance, there is nothing about political parties. There is not even anything about the existence of the cabinet. What is in the Constitution is only the reference to the role of the Governor General as having the power to potentially dissolve the Parliament and to dismiss ministers. We know that they cannot, the Governor Generals, to act in an arbitrary fashion because we have conventions that dictate that most of what he or she does needs to be done on the advice of the government. But to be frank with you, it seems to me that some of these appointments are so utterly bizarre that we should never expect the head of the executive to actually have concern about the preservation of even the principles of constitutional monarchy. You know, for instance, that in Queensland, the chief health advisor, that disastrous person who is causing the mayhem of Queensland, has just been appointed to be the governor of Queensland. So the system, we used to make it work properly because in my PhD thesis, I used to refer to the fact that we had a culture of legality, which is a respect and an appreciation for basic principles or elements for the realization of the rule of law. But because our culture has changed, the realization of the rule of law is now lacking because for this to happen, it's a combination of a political, cultural, social environment and a matter of legal institutional design. If you don't have these two elements working together, then we don't have the realization of the rule of law, or perhaps we can have is the fulfillment of the worst of all prophecies that a democracy can easily become an indirect or less open or more disguised form of elected dictatorship. So that's what we are facing now, not a normal democracy, but rather an elected dictatorship.
Is it realistic to think that maybe, the governor generals will step in like they did with what was the past prime minister? They got sacked the
That
whole
was
government.
Whitlam in the
Golf Whitlam,
1970s.
of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the problem with that was, the Australian people didn't like that one bit at all. I think they just discovered what their democracy actually is, that the Queen's representative can sack, the whole country's government and trigger a fresh election. Do you really think that these, governors, or governor generals will actually do anything like that?
Well, our culture has changed quite remarkably. Think about the fact that the left has been very good in advancing its long march through the institutions. And most of the younger generations, by the same, they tend to be the victims of a brainwashing by the educational system in this country. We even have something called the national curriculum. And I was invited a couple of years ago to a conference of the Christian Schools Australia, something of this nature, in Canberra. And one of those who were attending there was the then education minister, Simon Birmingham. And after my talk, I was just presenting the facts and how despicable the national curriculum is in producing, dumbing down curriculum that turns the students into very alienated people that have no idea about basically anything. They don't know, for instance, the crimes committed by communist regimes under Stalin, the Soviet Union, or Mao Zedong in China. Basically, they have no knowledge of anything, but they become radical environmentalists in year 12. They know only bad things about our majority Christian faith in this country. So it's really a terrible approach, and also a sense of lack of proper respect and appreciation for their own culture via the so-called multiculturalist agenda. And of course, this is a project initially could have good intentions, but now has been used ultimately to deconstruct the values of Western civilization. So all these things were done. Initially, the curriculum was created by the Labour Party, But the Liberal Party did nothing to remove this terrible thing. It's bad enough that you would have a national curriculum, but then when you see that the national curriculum was actually designed by a former member of the Communist Party, it makes it even worse. So all these things are responsible for the problem that you now face. And when I was asked during that conference what to do to the national curriculum, I have made the point very clear that it is so terrible that it deserves to go to the garbage bin. We should not even think ever about having such a thing as national curriculum because it is giving the opportunity for social engineers to control the minds and hearts of all the children in this country. And so it's really cruel and terrible. And of course, that is connected with that thing I mentioned before, that we have not been vigilant enough. And now we are going to pay this price. That's the price of losing of freedoms as a result. But there is something we can do. It's to fight against the status quo and to be able to restore those rights and freedoms that the students don't even know about because they have been so alienated and indoctrinated that they don't have even a sense of what they are and the values and traditions that they should have to respect.
Yeah, we've got a lot of people trying to re-educate the people in that area. I mean, that's why I've got Turning Point, sort of doing what it's doing and trying to re-educate people through the videos that we make with the interesting guests that we get on, the experts like you, Professor. What can people expect with postal voting? We still have our vote in this country, but I'm not familiar with how the postal voting system works here.
Yeah, well, I'm not an expert in the subject, but certainly postal voting can aggravate the problem of electoral fraud. In a certain sense, it's very important to avoid what's happening in America, where there are so many of these postal votes coming in that you start to be highly suspicious that people are actually filling them for others that are not necessarily the people who are sending these postal offices are really those who have actually voted for the particular candidate. In America, it was quite clear during the American elections. Another thing is that some form of better identification of the voter is important so that we avoid people voting 2, 3, 4 times for a particular candidate. So all these things, we will have to be very careful because we know very well that we have a reality of unsatisfaction now in the air. We have so many people who want to teach these two parties a lesson, and I'm starting to really be rather suspicious that they might actually try to make it more difficult in the process. I'm not claiming anything here, but I once again must say that we have to be very careful that the whole thing doesn't become so irreversible that rather than having these temporary lockdowns and living under such an oppressive reality, that this is going to become permanent rather than being only temporary. I'm starting to be highly suspicious that what we had in the past might not necessarily be easily returned. And that's when we have to start to think what went so terribly wrong and restart our own reformation of the system so that we can finally have a proper system of checks and balances. We can finally have the doctrine of separation of powers instituted in this country with the protection of individual rights and freedoms and a vision of government that's about a limited government with lower taxes. That's what I want. I want to have this opportunity to create our own reformation and to teach these authorities a lesson that you'll never forget.
I think that when it comes to postal voting, and I can speak to the American system, there's multiple different types of postal voting that we saw across the states in America. Last year, they brought in this thing called universal postal voting. And the problem with that is, in America, guys, just so you know, it's not mandatory voting. Over here in Australia, you get fined if you don't have a legitimate reason to not vote. Over there, the tough part is actually getting people out to vote, to inspire them. In the 2016 election, they saw a massive dip in getting people out there because neither of the candidates they saw were inspiring. It was the highest unfavorable ratings. So with postal voting over there, there's this thing, you could do where you could request a ballot, where you directly say, hey, I can't make it there to the election poll, can you send a ballot directly to my address? And you're expecting it and it comes. That's fine. That's pretty safe. What's not safe is universal mail-in voting, where they send it to every man, woman, and child, well, anyone that can actually vote. And basically, you know, if you don't vote and you don't use it, anyone can go grab it, vote for you, and then put it in. Also, there's this thing called ballot harvesting, where, you know, people can, from the parties, they can actually go to your house, depending on the state, there's different rules. They can go to your house and say, hey, have you voted? And, you know, it might be an old lady, or it might be a nursing home. And, you know, you could sort of be like, yeah, vote for this candidate. And you sort of, I'll show you how to vote. And then they go and make it, or they'll be like, yeah, I'll take your vote for you if you've already done it. And they'll take it and they'll look at what you've done and they'll throw it in the trash, or they'll change it, or, you know, this is the sort of stuff that goes on over there, guys. Now, in Australia, it's a little bit different. It's a bit safer from what I've heard. I still, as I said before, I'm not an expert. I'm still making my inquiries, but it sounds like you request it, it comes directly to you. Other people don't know, you know, that's happening, and that goes from there. But you know, don't get me wrong, though. You should be vigilant. We should all be very interested in our democracy and how this thing's going. But
because we know very well that the political class sometimes disappoint us enormously when we hold high expectations. When I was a commissioner, I was really shocked to see, I was a law reform commissioner here from 2012 to 2017. And my interactions with the political class really disappointed me very dearly, because I had the impression that they really had the best interests in mind, that they really wanted to exercise their political role in a way that would ultimately advance the common good, that would be for the well-being of the community as a whole. But then I realized that this is not the case at all. Sometimes what they really want is to advance their agendas. If that can potentially preserve them or keep them in power. So that's what they do. They are able to sell their souls to the devil in order to stay in power. So we have to start electing people who really love the people of this nation. We need to start choose politicians who have a respect and a regard for the rights and traditions that we have inherited from our forefathers, and a sense of duty and even commitment to the preservation of the constitutional system, the constitution of this country that's being under a massive attack at this present moment by both state and federal governments. So once again, I have to tell you that we have to learn a lesson and avoid to repeat the mistakes that are now responsible for the problems that we are envisaging.
Absolutely. And I think that all begins with education and making sure people vote right, because we still have our vote. Guys, if you're listening to this right now and you think there's someone that should hear this, remember to give this conversation a share after we finish up. Augusto, I feel like there's a million things we could talk about, and I don't know where to go with this. Constitutionally speaking, I feel like we've barely touched the surface, and I feel like we need like a whole other podcast to talk about this. There's a lot of people that they say they're experts on the Constitution, and you know, I don't know if they are. I don't know if they're not. There's a lot of people that are new to politics because of the virus. They've sort of, you know, been engaged in politics because the government's been encroaching in their lives, and they're looking for answers. And I often get concerned that, you know, they're hearing stuff, but then don't have the opposite voice. So it's like fake news, but of the freedom fighters sort of end. And I get worried sometimes because I like to guide people and, you know, hold their hand, you know, while we're going through a lot of this stuff. And I speak to the things that I understand. But the constitutional law stuff, I just don't get. I don't understand it. It's not my area of expertise. I come from construction. And I'd love to do another podcast with you, because I know you've got to get going. You've got some guests coming over. I'd love to do another podcast with you where we go through that a bit more. Is there anything specifically, and the floor is yours for as long as you want, is there anything specifically you wanted to get to knowledge to the people?
Well, look, we have to understand that the reason as to why we have a constitution is for the preservation of our fundamental rights and freedoms. The constitution divides the power of the state. And the whole idea about having a federal system is because we can have not only one central government, because the vehicle for the establishment of oppression or for dictatorships to arise is exactly the problem of concentration of power. So the drafters were very wise to divide power into federal and state in order to be able to divide the power of the state and to make this power more, I would say, closer to the individual, to be closer to the citizen, in accordance with the principle or idea that whatever can be done by the citizen, him or herself, should not even be done by government. But we should never give to a higher level of power what a lower level of power that's closer to the citizen can do in a better way. What's happening now is that some of the state powers, the state governments are now using the powers that they have not to promote the constitutional spirit, not to protect the constitutional framework and the inalienable rights of the individual. But now we have a sort of a conspiracy, real one, taking place between these different tiers of government that are working together for the undermining of fundamental elements or principles of the rule of law, which obviously include the idea of legal certainty, because the laws are no longer certain. We have these people make decisions on a daily basis. It's impossible to have stability in life and predict your actions in the future if decisions can be done that completely change the dynamics of your reality on a daily basis. We have to do something to put an end to this in order to preserve the spirit of constitutionalism in this country. That is the idea of separation of powers and protection of fundamental individual inalienable rights, such as the right to life, liberty, and property. And in accordance with Samuel Griffith, that's the reason as to why we have a legal system. St. Augustine would say that that's the difference between have a government and a criminal organization, because criminals are those who use their powers to oppress and to remove freedom. But a real government is the one that protects the rights and the freedoms of the people. And we have to fight to recover these rights and freedoms that they are stealing from us. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and we will prevail, and we will honor our founders in this country and give this important legacy to our future generations. And you can count on me for this. I wrote a PhD thesis on the subject. I did my whole life is dedicated to the protection of the constitutional framework. I'm not going to allow this to continue. We will be together in this fight, and we will prevail.
Thank you, Augusto, so much. Guys, I feel bad. I want to go on for another 3 hours with Augusto, but I want the next conversation to be targeted at really the practicality of it and understanding of the Constitution. If I was to summarize this discussion, you guys are asking the question, what can we do, Professor? From this discussion, I'd summarize, you need to become more educated on this stuff. What does that actually mean? That means you've got to find channels that are going to help you educate, on this stuff. Go follow Augusto. Follow him now, Augusto Zimmermann. If you search that into Facebook, he posts regularly. He writes and he posts his articles there regularly. That'll help you become more articulate and knowledgeable on the topic. Join a political party. Everyone should have at least one member of their family join a political party. So that you find a party that you think is really going to represent what you like, and go from there. Now, for those of you, this is another announcement I've got. Augusto, you're going to love this. For the federal election and the state election, I'm coming out not only with how to vote cards, but a comparison of all the parties and where they fit on certain policies. So it's going to be a check card. It's going to have the policies, and it's going to have a cross or a tick next to it. So do they believe in censorship online? Tick or cross, tick or cross. No black and white. Do you believe in net zero or not? And those are the sort of things we're going to go on. Do you believe in the lockdowns? That's going to allow you guys to pick what party you want to join. Because I understand, guys, you guys are busy. You're taking care of your kids. You know, you don't know who these people are. You don't know if you should trust them or not. In terms of management and admin, I've got you covered. I've got a great team, and because people have been donating to Turning Point, I've been able to really bring this together. This is something that I've wanted to do for a long time, and it's to take that burden off your shoulders. It takes a lot of trust, don't get me wrong. You have to keep an eye on, you know, who is funding Turning Point, because it's a not-for-profit. You can see that sort of information. But I want to make sure that you guys have this information, and if you trust the brand that we offer, I think it's going to be a really useful tool. So join a political party. And the third thing is, make sure you remember to do how to vote, and you vote the right way. Honestly, you need to vote. I'm not telling you to vote a certain way. I'm recommending that you vote a way that represents your values. Even if you're a lefty, I want you to look at the parties, investigate what they stand for, and hold them account. Even if you're a lefty, join the political parties. I don't care who you are. We need more Australians to be engaged in their democracy. The reason things have gotten so bad is because in states like only New South Wales, only 0.5% of the voting population here are members of political parties. And if you're not in a political party, then you don't get to pick who the candidates are. You don't get to pick what policies get up. You don't get to pick a bunch of different things. Just to give you an example, when Gladys Berejiklian passed the abortion laws, it could have been beaten if within the Liberal Party they had enough people to vote against it. Now, I'm not telling you to join the Liberal Party. I'm probably encouraging you to join the Freedom parties. But the point is, if you're not in the game, if you're not in any political parties, then you're out of the game. You're at the mercy of these oligarchs, the 0.5%, not even 1%. You're at the mercy of 0.5% of the voting population, the elites. You need to engage with your democracy. I'm here to help you make it happen. And I'm really thankful because I've had some phenomenal people like Professor Augusto Zimmermann and Dr. Stephen Shavira, another brilliant expert I interviewed earlier in the week. And you know Dr. Stephen Shavira.
Yeah.
I want to get you two guys on at the same time. I want to get also Professor David Flint, which that'll happen relatively soon.
It'll be a pleasure.
But Augusto, Professor rather, thank you so much for coming on. You're a wealth of knowledge, and I don't think we've even scratched. We haven't scratched the surface of your understanding of what we can do and the Constitution and everything related. But I want to thank you. You've been so generous with your time, and I'm very much looking forward to having you on the next time.
Thank you very much. God bless you and those who are watching us. We will continue the good fight.
Absolutely. For those of you listening right now, if you want to see more conversations like this, please remember to donate to Turning Point, and we'll be sure to be bringing more of these to you. I've got an interesting announcement tomorrow. I will be on the ground. You'll be surprised where I'm at, most likely, if I haven't told you already. And we've got some exciting things happen. The best is yet to come, as Trump might say, and we'll see how we go. But I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take it easy.